Okay, thanks for being here. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and digital technologies today. We have a star-studded panel, which I am about to introduce. I'm Kate Niederhofer. I'm a social psychologist, and I'm a senior scientist at Better Up, where I work to increase purpose, passion, and clarity through non-psychedelic interventions. But I've spent the last 10 years or so in digital mental health, working with the likes of these fine people. And we are going to talk about this perfect intersection right now of everything cool, digital technologies and psychedelics. And so by way of introduction, I'm going to ask each member of the panel to introduce themselves and talk about what about that beautiful intersection, this kind of hyper cool moment in time, gets them most excited. So digital technologies and psychedelics. Arvind, you're on.
So I lead the technology division at Atai Life Sciences. For you that don't know, so Atai is an innovative mental health company. We've got 15 programs, which include compounds and technologies. And within the compound side, we've got psychedelics and non-psychedelics. What am I most excited about? I think there's two buckets. There's the opportunity to deploy digital therapeutics alongside the compounds, which we'll talk about. I think when people think about technology, particularly sort of juxtaposed with psychedelics, it's all about, we've got to remove the clinician. Actually, we're all about augmenting the clinician. And we'll talk about some of the sort of personalized and more engaging ways of delivering care. And the second thing that's very close to my heart, which is something I look after, is building our precision psychiatry engine. What we're trying to do is characterize the molecular basis of these diseases or indications and the sort of molecular, or the mechanisms of actions of these drugs. And I think what's exquisitely exciting about psychedelics in particular is, for the first time from a commercial perspective, we've got CNS drugs, medicines, that can take individuals from a afflicted state to a healthy state, right? This isn't just papering over the cracks. This isn't just treating symptomology. And so from the perspective of really trying to characterize these diseases, if we're able to understand what does that differential look like when the patients move from being afflicted to healthy, we can really start generating what I think is probably the most important part in this industry is super personalized care. And really moving away from a one-size-fits-all. My most exciting pieces.
That's great. Thank you, Arvind. Danielle.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I'm Danielle Schlosser. I'm the Senior Vice President for Clinical Innovation at Compass Pathways. For those who may not know about Compass, we're a mental health company that's pioneering a new approach to psilocybin therapy. So we're combining our proprietary synthetic version of psilocybin with a psychological support model. And in my role, I get to head up our clinical model development, our therapy optimization research, and our therapist training. My background is as a clinical psychologist, but I've been working in the digital health world for quite a while now, and I'm happy to be part of the cool club with all of you. So some of the things I'm really excited about, I would say one of the things is about this importance of set and setting in psychedelic medicine. So I've been working in the mental health space for 15 plus years, seen a variety of settings, and I feel like there's no emphasis in the mental health space that's regularly available for people where you think a lot about what the environment looks like, all the sensory inputs, all the messages we send to individuals who are seeking mental health care. We see all those as interventions. And so there's a lot of attention to that in the psychedelic space, which I'm really excited about. And so we can really innovate on patient experience and the experience for therapists as well. The other aspect, I would say, is the mechanism of action of especially the classic psychedelics. So for those of us who've been working in the mental health space or who've actually been affected by mental health conditions, we know that the existing treatments are failing us in our field. And so I'm really excited about a new therapeutic option where we see the opportunity that I haven't seen in my career, which is this ability to have rapid and sustained change in a really deep and meaningful way, where you see a degree of cognitive flexibility I haven't seen before, an ability to do really deep work and not require decades of psychotherapy to get there. So that's something else I'm really excited about.
That's great, thank you. Nick?
Thanks, and it is great to be here. My name's Nick Allen. I'm the CEO of Ksana Health, and Ksana Health is a digital mental health startup that's primarily interested in continuous behavioural health measurement and utilising that technology to improve assessment, therapy and services in the mental health field. I'm also a professor of clinical psychology at University of Oregon, and so I have the same professional background as Danielle. I think that there's a couple of things that I think are really interesting to me about the conjunction of digital technology and psychedelic medicines. First of all is, as I've mentioned, our particular technology that we're working on is really interested in being able to measure behavioural and mental health continuously. And when you have medicines that have this capacity for rapid therapeutic response, then that kind of technology has a really important match with that particular response curve. The older medicines that we have in mental health tend to work over weeks and months. These ones can work literally hours and days. And so being able to characterize that response curve in a way that's not intrusive and burdensome to the patient is really important affordance. The other thing that I think is really exciting is that because of the issues that both Arvind and Danielle have touched on, we're kind of building a new type of care system now. You know, something that where the psychological care that really potentiates the benefits of psychedelic medicines is being designed literally right now as we speak. And so we're doing that in a digital age. And, you know, when you go back to the other sort of behavioural mental health interventions, they were often not designed in a digital age. So we're really looking for ways in which we can leverage digital technology and ask some of these fundamental questions, like how can we scale this most effectively? What are the most important aspects of human versus automated support? What's the right balance there? You know, and so it's raising these really questions that are really fundamental for the field of digital mental health in general. But because there's this period of actually plasticity and creativity, you know, in terms of the psychological care, we're really getting to explore some of these fundamental questions about how digital technology can really potentiate that.
Great, thank you. I was thinking about what success would look like as this panel, and I was thinking that if I get to say set and setting at least 10 times, and that we could together build a new healthcare system that perfectly calibrates the role of human and technology, that we would be good at the end of about 45 minutes, allowing for you to ask questions. And so I think you have each set us up nicely to talk about efficacy, assessment, the entire pipeline, building the healthcare system. But I want to make it real for the audience and take a minute to talk about efficacy and what that looks like, and especially because you mentioned how rapidly you could see change and how that's an interest of yours. Can you tell us a bit of a story of what that looks like and how you're measuring efficacy?
For me. So at Compass, we just wrapped up the largest psilocybin trial ever conducted in a rigorous fashion. So we had 233 individuals with treatment-resistant depression go through a trial where it was a dose-finding trial. So we were looking at 1, 10, and 25 milligrams. So think of that in a recreational context. It's like a microdose, 1.5 to 2 milligrams versus 5 grams. Sorry, not milligrams. And so the idea is to try to figure out what we should carry forward in our pivotal efficacy study, our phase 3 program. So in that study, and in my role, I get to review with patients' consent, we record sessions for quality and safety. And so I've had the privilege to be exposed to a very large number of participants going through psilocybin therapy, which is just amazing. And I think we're really eager to share more stories and get the data out so all of you can benefit from that knowledge as well. So in this population, for those who may not be aware, so treatment-resistant depression, these are individuals with depression who failed at least 2 treatments. So these individuals generally have been living with depression for most of their lives, and the traditional approaches just aren't working for them. And So when you think about what does that look like, and when you're sitting with an individual with treatment-resistant depression, what you hear is a lot of fixed ideas about them being fundamentally broken, flawed, worthless, a lot of these ideas that just nothing works for me. I'm a failure. And so it can be really tough also being a clinician sitting with someone like that when you're like, my typical approaches just aren't working for you. And so in our trial, we saw that about 37% experienced a 50% or more improvement of depression symptoms at the 3-week time point. So that's really fast. We saw a lot of those changes even the day after. And the majority of those individuals sustained that response by 12 weeks. Remission, it was a little lower, so that's, their symptoms were totally resolved, and so that was more present in about 27% at week 3, and 95% of those people sustained their remission up to 3 months. So that's exciting. So I just want you guys to have some of the data, and then, of course, I'll share with you some of the stories. So when you sit with somebody before, you hear a lot of stories about themselves. It feels like they've rehearsed this story again and again. And the cadence of their speech is just, it's as if you could wake them up at 3 in the morning and they could just go on in telling their story, something they know well. What's remarkable is when you listen to people, we do integration sessions the day after and a week later, and you hear a noticeable change in just the style of their speech. How are they talking? There's more pauses, there's more thoughtfulness, there's more reflection, more of trying to make sense of this experience they just had, and how it's created a new way of thinking for them. We know the mechanism of action around the downregulation of the default mode network is creating flexibility of your usual ways of thinking and feeling and experiencing. And we get to see that manifesting in how people are talking about themselves. And so you hear people be like, talk in metaphor a lot. They're like, it's as if I feel the software being uploaded. That inner critic is silenced. And it feels like a bit of an awakening, like, wow, there's a new relationship to self happening, a new relationship to what these sensations and experiences are happening. It's really remarkable when you've worked in mental health for a long time and worked with more CBT or other psychotherapy approaches or other pharmacological treatments, change is really incremental. So you don't see these dramatic changes, and so it's more obvious, it's more noticeable, and people are kind of a little taken aback at the change they've experienced even in themselves. So sometimes you may even hear from people, they're like, whoa, can this be real? Is this really gonna be my new life, my new self? And so I think what we have to still learn and understand is how do we sustain that? I mean, we were pleased with what we saw in our trial, that it went out to 3 months for those people who had, positive benefit. But we need to do further studies. How long does that last? And what do you need in that integration period to sustain those benefits? But it's pretty exciting, I have to say.
Yeah, that's great. And it's exciting in a really human way. And I wonder if, Arvind, I can kind of pivot over to you, and you can talk about what role technology may even have in this story of really massive change in a way that we've never measured before, and in a continuous way, and in a model where we're used to looking at incremental change. What role does technology play in that situation?
So that's a great question. It's an all-encompassing question as well. I think the sort of biggest point that you sort of pick up from Danielle's story is, the durability. Mm-hmm. How do you actually sustain, long-term improved behavioral activity? Now, in an ideal world, you've got a patient who's gone through the treatment, who then just comes into the clinicians, comes into the clinic once a day, once a week over a 3, 6, 12-month period. Sadly, that is just not sustainable, right? And you have an aging clinician base. You have, sadly, a growing demand in terms of people that need that care. So for me, that's where digital monitoring comes into its own. Mm-hmm. And there's 2 elements of it. There is digital monitoring through, digital questionnaires, through EMAs. For me, that is still a bit of a burden on the patient. It's an active form of monitoring. One of the points that Danielle picked up is actually, can we start moving it into a much more passive style of data collection. So there's some great validation coming out in terms of speech, being able to use cadence, complexity of words, acoustic envelope of the patient speaking or just describing an environment, to either place them on the PHQ-9, for example, with a high degree of specificity and sensitivity, but also to be able to then use that measure, that sort of passive measure of how the patient is doing, to then personalize the treatment in that sort of 3, 6, 12-month period. I think the second thing that allows us to then start doing is to understand, can we start moving that into a predictive element? So we know, the patient is either about to, has relapsed, for example. Can we start getting ahead of that curve and actually start predicting that? And there's, some great validation around things like actigraphy, which really sort of capture some of the fatigue and, psychomotor retardation symptom domains of the questionnaires. So that for me then starts moving us into preventative medicine. I think the sort of second part to the monitoring aspect is we can start to be incredibly creative with how we deliver care, just by virtue of what the psychedelic clinical pathway looks like. So in particular, I'm thinking about the set and setting piece. There are some great ways of using virtual reality. That's a particular modality that's close to my heart, to create a hugely immersive set and setting piece up front, which is either just not scalable. Not everyone can go to a beautiful forest and do their set and setting piece, or sadly for some patients it may just not be safe enough. And then I think the second aspect is this neuroplasticity period. Right? We don't know what is the optimum clinical protocol to deliver in that period. We don't know how best to do it, but we do know that there is a phenomenal opportunity to give somebody high frequency psychotherapy. So for me, those are the key areas I can see digital playing.
That's great, and I want to use that to segue over to Nick about neuroplasticity, but if you could comment a little bit more about that assessment piece and sort of introduce the notion of digital phenotyping and how we would use continuous measurement in a realistic way.
Sure. Yeah, I think, as I said, one of the things that the kind of passive digital measurement that Arvind was referring to that's exciting is the ability to look at response curves over time and to understand the kind of the temporal dimension, the time-based dimension of what's happening with people. But the other thing I would like to pick up on is that many of the things that we can measure in this way actually go beyond just telling us whether someone's still depressed or not. So when you think about the kinds of fundamental building blocks of well-being, behavioural well-being, you've got things like sleep, physical activity, cognition and thinking styles, social relationships, functional engagement in life, being able to move around. And actually each of those elements, and there are others, can one, be measured in this kind of passive continuous way. And second, that gives you information that you can leverage for positive behaviour change. So if someone is the kind of person who, when they get stressed or distressed, their sleep is one of the things that gets discombobulated, for want of a better term, then it may well be that an intervention that's helping them to improve their sleep quality is a really personalised intervention. So I think, although I'm very interested in voice and I've done some work on voice and published on it in the past, I think the limitation of voice, from my point of view, is that it doesn't give you that kind of therapeutic leverage. It can certainly tell you something diagnostic, but these other patterns of behaviour are very informative. And so to the extent that you've got a period of plasticity when people can engage in new behaviours, new ways of thinking, new ways of experiencing the world and themselves, if you have digital therapeutics that can augment the other kinds of psychological support, or be part of, perhaps there's a better way to put it, the psychological support that people are experiencing, then the methods that we have now available can really not just tell us if someone's doing well or not, but more about what it is that they can focus on to achieve really personalised positive behaviour change.
So many things that I want to take from what you just said, because it feels like we're painting a very Pollyanna-ish view of technology and all that you can diagnose and predict, but I want to cushion these affordances with some of the limitations of digital and I want to admit that I'm totally thrown off by Nick looking at his hand and counting like the 5 fundamental things about human behavior. And I want to come back to that mnemonic if we have time.
Okay.
But for now, speaking of human and things that, bringing the technology back to reality, what are some of the limitations of technology as we think about scaling and all of the promise here that may not be the best fit right now? Danielle, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, so, all of us cool kids, we liked tech, right? And then now we're interested in psychedelics. And so, but it's really important that we don't just copy and paste what we've done in disease modification platforms, digital mental health, and think that it'll apply in psychedelics. And so what I first said is the importance of set and setting, and that includes the human, the therapist, the guide, the person who's sitting with you. And the unique therapeutic we're working with, where you do need to pair, from my perspective and from what some of the data show us, a therapist, somebody who's trained to support you. And that's for clinical populations. And I just want to distinguish that, our company is working more in a medical context. So this is not necessarily for recreational purposes. But if you're there to try to treat PTSD, major depressive disorder, an eating disorder, it's really important to be sitting with a trained professional. And so with that, I also appreciate the constraints of saying, well, if we're going to require a trained professional to sit with somebody for prep sessions, an administration session that could be 6 to 8 hours, and a number of integration sessions, that's going to limit access. Okay? So then we have the access issue, and then we have the quality issue, right? And we have to decide as a field, what are we comfortable with? And what I would prefer is let's do the studies first. Let's get the data. Let's test some different models. So, MAPS is pursuing an MDMA model where you have 3 administration sessions, 12 psychotherapy sessions. We, in our phase 2B study, we had 1 psilocybin administration session. We had 3 prep and 2 integration. Okay, so it's probably a less expensive treatment package. You heard, before what kind of outcome data we got from that. It still wasn't the definitive efficacy study, so we'll see from phase 3. What I think is really important for consumers and people who are going to be in the field making a decision, do I take psilocybin? Do I pursue MDMA? How many sessions do I do? I want all of us to have the data to inform that choice. So and then also, we haven't talked about some of the risks or downsides, which I know we'll get to in a minute, but it's important we appreciate not just the benefits, but also some of the trade-offs. And so I guess it's interesting hearing myself talk out loud, because I think I'm advocating for a little more of a conservative approach to start, and just say, well, let's keep the therapist. Let's have that. We can do some prep and integration remotely. I'm game. Let's try that. But the administration session, I think it needs to be in a clinical setting that we can make really beautiful and be thoughtful and intentional around the environment. But let's have it be supervised. We don't quite, these are really powerful substances, and let's have it be in a safe environment. We don't want to fall back to what happened in the 60s, where there was a lot of exuberance and we can do this anywhere. I would prefer that we take this more methodical approach, pursue a regulatory path, get the data, and then let's think about, okay, what are the aspects we can innovate on? I'm really curious about these ideas around personalization. I think my preference is more, might we be able to personalize before administration? Not just after. At Compass, what we're trying to do is optimize the psilocybin experience. So I understand there's been maybe a little criticism. It's not psychotherapy-assisted treatment, it's psychological support to support the psilocybin. And that distinction I don't think is really understood. So what we're trying to do is support people to have the most optimal therapeutic experience with psilocybin. And so in order to do that, we need to understand people before their psilocybin session. We need to map out all the pathways by which people may benefit or not benefit from psilocybin. There's many pathways. It's not just mystical experience. So we need to understand those pathways and then ideally help guide people and say, okay, we've learned about you, we've understood the different mechanisms of change, and let's try to tailor your treatment experience for those, particular pathways. And I would love it if, I do think technology has a role there in trying to understand the person, and also, of course, the therapist. I'm going on.
I
know. I hear your conservative standpoint, but I would like to throw a proverbial javelin over to Arvind.
Yeah.
I would like to be slightly provocative on that point.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with that, but I think that there's sort of two things from my side in terms of, so I agree with taking a sort of a measured approach to the technology side. But there's there's an absolute fact out there, which is that gap between supply and demand is just getting bigger. It's getting bigger every day, every week, every year. And so if we are going to wait on the technology side, in terms of really pressing the accelerator until we really understand how these drugs work, by the time we actually get to the end and they're FDA cleared, that wall of demand is only going to be bigger. I think one of the sort of key characteristics of digital therapeutics is the software model, and it really differentiates it from the compound side. So in the software model, you have the opportunity to make it better. You have the opportunity to test this with user testing. We're deploying these digital therapeutics alongside our compounds. We're then getting to the end of the clinical trials, looking at the feedback, again, going back in an iterative cycle and really trying to fit the digital therapeutic, as a hand-glove model. So you can go through that iterative process and sort of be building it in the background. And I think, what sort of the other side to that is the ability on the digital therapeutic side to actually run standalone trials. So without the compounds, with TRD patients, with PTSD patients, patient groups that we are trying to target with our psychedelic compounds and really try and develop the DTX both in combination but also in a parallel track. So when you get to the FDA clearance, it's ready to go.
Yeah, Nick, can you, take a stance between this sort of more conservative and more innovative way to kind of embrace the technology in parallel tracks and understand the molecular pipeline as well as the way that digital trials happen. So where do you stand in terms of how conservative we need to be in human and technology?
Well, of course, they're both right.
Oh, Nick, the crowd walks out.
But look, in my point of view, it all comes down to data. It's like, are we collecting the information to learn the things that we need to learn to determine these issues? So I think it's really important that as these trials are going through, and there's lots of them emerging, and that we really do measure everything we can measure about the variations in the methodology and the experience so that we understand what the critical points are. In terms of digital approaches to mental health in general, I would say that there's one finding that's pretty clear at the moment in terms of the data, and particularly the meta-analyses that have been run, which is that in general, and this of course is a high-level statement, digital methods that have a human in the loop in some way are more effective than those that don't. So this is completely aside from the psychedelic context. And so, and there are some reasons for that are pretty obvious. The first one is that most digital products these days that are for mental health are actually quite effortful to use. They involve a lot of journaling and logging and answering questions and doing tasks on the phone or the computer.
With some exceptions.
With some exceptions. And so as a result, about 70 or 80% of people stop using them within 2 to 3 days. That's an enormous drop-off. if you have some kind of human in the loop, whether it's a therapist or an asynchronous coach or a peer environment or whatever it is, the product tends to be more sticky and people engage with it longer. So bringing that sort of general finding over to this context, we need to understand what are the ways in which we can be most effective and most efficient. Because I think, as Danielle said, there's this tension between access and scalability, which we desperately need because we've got such a mismatch between supply and demand in the mental health field in general. Most people with mental health difficulties never get any kind of help at all, especially if you're looking globally. And so we've got a huge problem with supply and access. But at the same time, we know that when you scale something that doesn't work, it's a waste of time. And so you've got to address the quality issue as well. So that's where, and I don't have the answer to this, but that's the exquisite point that we've got to get to, where we understand how we can maximize the, frankly, expensive human resources that are required, and then leverage digital for what it can do, so that we can be most efficient in delivering care, but at high quality. And if you sacrifice quality, then access and scalability doesn't matter, in my opinion.
And I just want to jump onto that, because totally right. So when you talk about engagement from the patient perspective, there's also an aspect of engagement from the clinician perspective.
Yeah.
Really making sure that whatever digital tools they have at hand are, totally integrated into their workflow. And you look at some of the DTXs out there right now, Achille and Pear, you can scratch under the surface, look at their numbers, look at how many hospitals they're in. The clinical, the validation is there. They're just not getting prescribed. And so you really kind of dig deep and you understand it's one, a bit of a, integrating into the workflow. And then there's two, a education piece to the clinicians to really understand how does this work. I'm already burnt out. I've already got my book that's double booked. How does using this digital tool not only improve my patient base, but also make my life slightly better and slightly easier?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said about more data, more human, and in fact, I have a hypothesis that the more human, the more hyper-personalized the care is. But I'd like to throw out the idea of digital humans and speak on behalf of the audience who's clamoring in my ear, like VR. What about VR? It's so obvious. So, what about that? And Danielle, maybe pick up from, having like a very human-centric standpoint. Both keeping a clinician engaged and patient. What can we do in VR and what can't we do?
VR. So, okay. So with VR, I've heard there's a lot of interest in using VR in this space. I think VR, has been successfully used in some studies in terms of exposure therapy and managing anxiety disorders, and then also in physical rehabilitation. We talked about this last night, Arvind. And then I've heard a variety of ideas of VR in the psychedelic space. So everything from use it as a preparation tool to either simulate the psychedelic experience, help with meditation techniques and relaxation, so tools people can use in the administration session, to during the psychedelic experience, guiding the trip, and then integration, so helping people make, kind of re-experience their psychedelic journey and try to reinforce some of the therapeutic components of it. Okay, so that's kind of the range of use cases, and you guys can fill in if there's others. So I became really curious about this, and so I said, all right, how many of you guys have tried a VR set? All right, woo!
I told you I heard
you were right. You're psychic. It's amazing. Okay, so I hadn't tried one until recently, and at first, so I tried a couple of off-the-shelf products. Some were better than others. I won't name names. For the ones that were better, I was really impressed by the graphics. The experiences were phenomenal. And I immediately had actually a really good impression. I thought, this is really relaxing, this is beautiful, this is just, wow, like the technology has gone really far. And then when I learned about the use cases, I tried it again. I also was watching more sessions and trying to think, how could this work? Because we're trying to innovate on the therapy approach, and it would be nice if we could. So then I noticed, gosh, I was wearing this thing, and I was realizing my head kind of hurts, and then my eyes kind of hurt, and I'm like, okay, it's been like 7, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and I'm like, oh no, what were people thinking? You can use this to guide your journey, and do you really need more stimulation when you're on a psychedelic? And so I'm like, I don't know about that use case, right? So anyhow, so that's just my personal experience in it. I think we have to study it more and think about how we would want to use it. My preference would be more probably in prep or integration rather than the administration. I think as soon as we start thinking we should over-engineer the experience, that's where we've gone too far.
Either of you can comment. Would you like?
Well, I've got this experience.
Yeah, no, so I used to run a virtual reality company, Oxford VR, so I totally agree with you. I think virtual reality is not an easy technology to use, and I think most of the issues around deployment. So actually getting it on site, you've got these tethered, these are sort of powerful virtual reality headset that required being plugged into a gaming laptop. And so, we had a 450 person RCT running through the National Health Service treating schizophrenia patients. And one of the biggest issues we had from the clinicians was, this is great, but where do I put it? You've got cables coming out left, right, and center. We don't have enough space to sort of, swing a cat, let alone have a dedicated VR space. So I think we need to treat virtual reality with a little bit of caution. I think there are some incredible characteristics that no other modality can equal. So the immersivity, you sort of mentioned the exposure therapy, skills practice. Nick, you were talking about this yesterday, and obviously sort of physical rehabilitation. I think outside of that, I would try and use another modality if it can achieve the same effect, because there's also a cost aspect, right? There is absolutely a cost aspect. Can we achieve the same setting outcome using an app versus using which would be 10 cents, whatever it gets priced at, but 10 cents per patient, versus using a virtual reality headset, call it $500 a patient, and then you start talking about actually, do we deploy it at home? Do we get them to use it when they come into the clinic? If we deploy it at home, there'll be an element of shrinkage. We'll lose 10% of them a year. So yeah, I should be a little bit more biased towards virtual reality than I actually am. But yeah, I think we need to treat it with a bit of caution.
Nick, go ahead and comment on that if you'd like.
I think you've covered it well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I'm curious what else is missing from, we've talked about building a new treatment model, and we've talked about, some notion of an interdisciplinary care team, some role for technology, particularly in measurement, potentially during and after as well. Are there other elements of the care system that are missing now that you think we need to be thinking about as much as we're thinking about technology and the integration of digital?
Well, one thing that I'd say is that, the model that we've used to deliver behavioural and mental health care services, which is these occasional appointments that you have with your clinician, that, you kind of have to go back out into your life and kind of survive on your own in a way. It's really just not the way you would design a service these days. If you were designing a new service these days, you wouldn't say well, we'll have these experts sit in a room, and then we'll have a bunch of people go and sit in another room and wait until they're ready, and then they'll come in and they'll get a limited amount of time with them, and then they'll leave, and then they'll have to kind of do their best until they come back the next time. You just wouldn't design it like that. You design it with kind of an app that kept you in touch with people, that, kind of gave you the resources that you needed in your daily life to actually follow through with the things that you're meant to be doing. It's just very different. And so I think that, when we talk about, so I think that's a challenge. People, we have technology that gives us the possibility of delivering this more consistent experience of care and support than the traditional system provides. And this is probably important in all areas of behavioural health care, but in psychedelics, we've got this idea that's been, that there's something that you can learn prior to the dosing session about the individual. There's preparation, and then after the dosing period, there's a period of integration and plasticity, and it sounds like all of us are to some degree on board with the idea that human support is going to be an important part of that, but how do you make the human support more consistent and ubiquitous for the person? Because people, mental health is about life. It's about what you do out there. It's not about what you do in the office. And that's when you need the support. That's when you need the help. That's when you need the nudge. And so that's, I think, and this may be particularly true with psychedelics because there is this period post-dosing where there's this unique opportunity maybe to lock in positive change, and how can we deliver that to people at some kind of scale with a greater sense of being more consistently supported and followed through that process.
Yeah, it's so interesting about service design when you think about, how would we start if we could start fresh today? Because in many ways we can, but we have these existing models that I think we're throwing at the problem, like at-home care comes to mind, where it's like, hey, we have, thinking about ubiquitous care, thinking about being human, we love subscriptions, like, can we do this at home? And then, of course, you see this happening, right? There are a lot of companies that are doing that. I'm going to ask you to comment on that, but I do want to just say, start thinking of your questions, because in about 3 minutes, we'll take a break, and you guys can start to ask some questions. So, Arvind, I'm going to start with you. Tell me about at home. Does that make sense to throw that model at this problem?
Yeah, I think we've got some strong views about this on the panel, which is good. I think from a technology, from an ATI perspective, from my own personal perspective, I want to try and reach as many people as possible. That is absolutely the aim. If we can do that in utilizing an at-home model, then I'm absolutely all for it. I think there is a little bit of concern when people talk about, can you use the psychedelic model at home? And I think we need to be very clear, what compound are we talking about? Because there are psychedelics and there are psychedelic-like. So you've obviously got ketamine and MDMA on one side, and then you've got the psilocybins, the DMT. Now, do I think we have ibogaine in our portfolio? Do I think ibogaine could be an at-home model? Probably not. Probably not. Do I think that we can deliver ketamine at home? Well, if we can prove that it delivers the efficacy, if we can prove that the safety is there, then why would we preclude an at-home model? So I think it goes back to, can we actually work out whether this model works at home? And I know that there's a little bit of a tangential there as well, because I say there are other parts of using technology around, very early in the chain in terms of AI-driven drug discovery, looking at trying to engineer certain properties to or out of the compounds. And I know obviously the sort of experience aspect, the hallucinations, is a big area that people are trying to go for, because that would lend that compound very well to being used at home. And I think we need to come back to, actually, is that going to deliver the same clinical outcomes as using a compound that can only be used within a clinical protocol workflow with a clinician by your side? I think it's going to come back. It's going to come down to outcomes.
Well, Nick, as somebody who sits in a seat of clinical protocol as well as sort of startup entrepreneurship, is there another model that comes to mind that you think we need to pay attention to in this very ripe moment of the intersection?
Another model for
understanding the balance of human and digital, and the way that we balance access and quality.
Well, I think, so I think that there are models, and I think that, the field has to pursue two agendas. I think we have to do these really high quality clinical trials, RCTs, like Compass and ATI are pursuing. It's incredibly important, and it'll be critical for the ultimate acceptance and utilization of these medicines. But we also there are other models that can be used, the so-called treatment optimization models, that are kind of more rapid iteration approaches, things like factorial designs, micro-randomized trials, step care design, smart designs. I won't go into all of them, but there's a whole bunch of methods that are used that actually people in startup and technology would recognize a bit more, because they're rapidly iterative and they allow you to test hypotheses quickly and learn. So I think we need to have both. I think we need to have these really high quality randomized controlled trials. That's the standard of evidence that you need in medical care, and that's appropriate. The RCT is the gold standard for a reason. But I think we also need, the problem with RCTs is they're slow and lumbering. You kind of do it, it takes X number of years, and then you go, I wonder why that worked or why it didn't work, or I wonder what the critical bit was, or whatever like that. And then you have to do another, and so that's too slow. And so I think you need to have combined with these treatment optimization approaches where you're experimenting quickly with different aspects of the protocol and learning rapidly, so that when you go to the RCT, you've actually got what, your best guess of the most effective and optimized package of treatment is.
Yeah, Danielle, I'm wondering if you could speak and potentially close us out with this idea of like monitoring clinical trials, and as an audience who stereotypically is aggressive on technology and scale, what's important for us to keep in mind as we interpret results from clinical trials, taking into account myths and misperceptions of results of clinical trials? Like, what do we need to keep our eye on so we don't get caught up in the scale?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I was also thinking about your other question of how can we innovate in the mental health field in general, and what's the role of technology and data. So I would say, if any of you want to go see a therapist, how do you know if they're good?
Perceived
really
match, Danielle.
Right,
Perceived
right.
match.
And then let's say, and you want to get psilocybin from that therapist. Oh my. So you're not just talking, right? You're going to go through a pretty deep, profound, potentially profound experience with them. So the stakes are higher. So I would say, just like at the beginning when we talked about the importance of set and setting, I would say quality needs to be right up there with that. Now, our efforts to ensure quality, evaluate it, have really failed in the mental health field, I would say. So I'm excited about a new opportunity to do this, and the fact that this field is emerging from clinical trials where you typically do care a lot about quality. So we have the benefit, for instance, with patient consenting, we're going to monitor everything about you. We're going to ask you a ton of questions, we're going to have you fill out surveys, we're going to record your sessions, and we're going to analyze all that data to make sure that this is a safe and effective trial for you. Well, that's creating a foundation of knowledge that's really valuable, that can benefit patients. So what my hope is, and my vision, is that we can create a system that's a closed loop system where we can leverage the clinical trial data, where we can learn what are the indicators of quality, can we measure and observe these things, and then can we create a product that we can then take to market that clinics may use to evaluate maybe new clinicians who are joining, who want to deliver psychedelic assisted treatment, where we can actually evaluate, are they delivering good care? Can we make, and then ideally, we want to make this attractive to clinics so that they can know that they're building a reputation for quality. They have some data, some evidence about that. And so, I think the fact that we're starting to think about this in the clinical trial phase, this has not been done before. So, the other big, pharma companies out there, their goal is to put a drug into the market. We're looking at putting an entire treatment experience to market. So I'm hoping that other companies as well, or other groups who are working in this space, are also thinking about this, because we're going to need a lot of data and a real focus on rigorously evaluating quality, making it into a product, making that accessible for clinicians and patients so it can benefit all of us.
That's a very great way to summarize, I think, points that everybody agrees on in terms of quality, the importance of data, and also just this notion of bringing an entire experience, not just a molecular compound to market, and and how nuanced that is, and how it does take multidisciplinary perspectives. I gave you the opportunity to ask questions, but now yes, please do. Okay.
Thank you. So, I was going to ask, if you look at psychology, right, you see a lot also about positive psychology, so not just how you treat illness, but how do you make life better, more worth living, and to that pyramid, right? And I don't know if I'm right, but just listening to these panels, I feel like everything that is not treating a pathology is like put in the recreational bucket, which can be like I'm clubbing, but also I'm having a very thoughtful experience. Is there someone looking at the more positive side that's maybe not necessarily looking at pathology, or should there be someone, and what do you think?
Oh, you mean oh yeah, do you want to talk?
Well, I just wanted to clarify the question. So in terms of, are we saying instead of looking at clinical outcomes, actually looking at, say, quality of life?
No, I just mean like not looking just at like how can I treat a pathology, but how can I get someone that has no pathology and make their life better?
Yeah, we're operating in more of a medical clinical context, and so I can't speak for other groups. I know in Oregon, who just legalized, or they were in the process of legalizing psilocybin, they're looking at more of a wellness application. So, but it hasn't been studied rigorously, and I don't know of other groups that are. So, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yes, I am curious, how is it on a large scale for the betterment of all people that want to get treatment for psilocybin, for PTSD, for MDD, to patent something? How is that going to be beneficial to individuals all across the board?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know if anybody else wanted to take it.
That's all yours.
I'll take it.
No, it's a fair question. I appreciate the opportunity to answer the question. So I would say the benefit of what we're doing is that we can commercialize a product and make it available to as many people as possible. So to be able, and also what I would say is these clinical trials are no joke, hundreds of millions of dollars, okay? And so there's different approaches for how you can do this. Pretty much 99.9% of the approaches to take a drug to market is in a for-profit model.
Correct.
And you have to patent the drug to be able to raise money and to be able to take that drug to market. MAPS, I know, has paved the way. I'm so impressed with what they've done in being able to, raise money. They will be the only pharma company ever in history to take a drug to market without patenting it. So that, kudos to them. It's really amazing and impressive. It just, there's different models to take drugs to market, and we chose a different one.
But I know that you guys are being rigorously extensive with your set and setting, with other areas that are in the patent. Why would you go about something of patenting or trying to patent set and setting that has been around for a very long time? It would make a small practitioner and their practice be able to, hey, well, I can't no longer do this. I have to now pay this guy to be able to even have purple wallpaper in my
Yeah,
room.
no, it's a fair question. I don't think we're going to be going after individual clinicians, but I will say we talked a lot today, for instance, about we're also just not taking a drug to market, we're taking a whole treatment experience. So we wanted to be mindful that, there's a lot of thoughtfulness around that treatment package and that experience, so.
I guess that is an answer to that, but that's okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm not sure who this question is for, and I hope I don't sound ignorant in asking it. But a lot is said about set and setting, the importance of the prep, and then the integration afterwards. And it's almost implied that that's the only quality way to do things. But we also know that that there are natural experiences and so forth. So I would like to know, are there any of the best quality evidence, randomized clinical trials, to show that the prep and the integration actually make a difference? Or is this just something that's taken as an article of faith?
So let's just repeat the question to make sure that we've got it and everybody understands. The question is about the importance of prep and integration as opposed to the experience per se, and whether there's any empirical data to support the importance of those time periods. Arvind?
I mean, there's a bit of work that's come out of Robin's lab at Imperial, so I think they've looked at, so for them they've seen the correlation to clinical outcomes is much stronger for the mystical experience, for the actual experience type, versus the psychotherapy that's delivered in the follow-up, in the immediate follow-up. So that's your sort of experience versus the reintegration aspect. And then if you take the next step down, there is a correlation to clinical outcomes relative to, again, the type of experience you have. Now, we know the set and setting piece up front is critical to ensuring that, one, there is, or you maximize the opportunity for a mystical experience, and secondly, that you minimize any risk of adverse events.
How do you know that?
Sorry?
How do you know that?
I mean, this is through sort of RCTs and lab research.
Do you have empirical data?
There will be validation papers out there. Yeah.
Arvind, maybe I can help. So we don't have a lot of data just teasing apart the component parts. So it's a fair question, but the Imperial group, they've gotten a paper accepted. Should be out any day now. I think at the New England Journal. And they've looked at the role of therapeutic alliance, influencing various mechanisms of change, including mystical experience and emotional breakthrough, and the degree to which that influences outcome. And I don't want to spoil their findings, but it definitely seems to play a really robust role. But we need to do more research, but at least that is some indication that the presence of the therapist, that relationship is important.
Okay, well, that's good to know, because honestly, it was coming across as kind of a religious belief, and without knowing what the evidence was, it's actually good to know that there is some evidence.
Yeah, no, we need to collect the evidence for sure. Thank you.
So we'll do one more official question and then we'll close out.
Okay. This is a two-part question. Sorry about that. First one is, we're in the psychedelic realm, and we're in the digital age realm, and we talk about scalability, and I'm a provider that's actually looking to do ketamine treatments, but my biggest question right now is the brick and mortar versus the online digital platform. And the biggest thing I worry about is how can we provide, in the clinical setting, you have people there physically watching over you if you have a bad trip, if you're hypertensive, if there are some other comorbidities that need to be addressed. But what suggestions or what solutions do we have in terms of if someone's on the other side of the screen and you give them a lozenger, how are we going to really safely monitor their treatment process? That's the first question. And then the second question is regarding the set and setting. I'm familiar with the studies that MAPS has done with psilocybin, but I'm not familiar with the patenting around the set and setting aspect of this, and I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on what is patented and what's not, and how that's going to affect other providers who do want to provide psilocybin in the clinical context in their practices.
Yeah. Nick, do you want to take the first part of the question about measurement?
I can say a few things quickly about the first part. Obviously, there are methods for remote patient monitoring that would allow you some insight into those things. I think the important question is to understand, what's most critical, for which kinds of remote patient monitoring do we have reliable solutions. So that's my quick comment, is that there are methods, that are increasingly used because healthcare is becoming virtualized.
Other than the trips that are there, right?
Yeah.
If you are having a bad trip and you are feeling the need to escape, who's going to
I think that's a totally other question.
Yeah.
I think if you're talking about being able to monitor physiological signals and things like that, there are some solutions. I won't speak for the others, but I would say the concern that you're raising there, I very much share.
I think that goes to the heart of the at-home versus the in-clinic model. So I think what you find in some sort of high-volume ketamine clinics, there is a bit of a hybrid where you'll have multiple patients being dosed at the same time. They'll be monitored through, there'll be an EEG, there'll be a sort of HRV, etc., and they'll be monitored from a central position. If something goes wrong, you'll then have the clinician coming in. This is absolutely still in the clinic. So this then goes back to actually, if that is what the safety profile of the compound looks like, can it be delivered safely at home?
So why don't we're going to close this out, and then you guys can follow up with the panelists for more questions after. But I think we've heard a lot about access, scale, quality, measurement. Are there three last words that each of you want to say in terms of your hopes and dreams for psychedelics and digital therapies?
Make it engaging.
Say it.
Make it engaging.
Make it
Straight away,
engaging.
isn't
You got it?
I think we win on that. We're the most fun and cool mental health treatment, so I think it's really about make it safe and effective.
Collect the data.